Okay, thank you, Angela, and good morning. I'm still working on my first cup of coffee, so forgive my voice. Again, my name is Dina Griffin. I'm an employment and workplace safety attorney. I do litigation and training to make sure that our employers are great places to work and don't get sued, hopefully. We're going to get started post haste just to go over our roadmap. So we're going to start talking about the law and our policies here at the city. We're going to do a quick overview of discrimination. These are all reminders. I think everyone kind of knows. We're going to go through harassment and then kind of take a little nuanced chat about microaggression, retaliation, workplace bullying, and follow up with some practical tips. So we're going to start with Winston-Salem policy. And I think why I start here is because this is our goal. I mean, hopefully, we're working and striving and getting to the vision, mission, and values of our city every day, but this is our goal. And in order to do that, the workplace and serving on boards and in leadership in the city, it really needs to be absent of discrimination, harassment, workplace bullying, so on and so forth. I think when we think about our ethics policy, I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with our ethics policy, this holds our leaders to a really high standard. Not that y'all can't reach it, because you can, but it does hold our leaders to a really high standard. We don't want to bring any discredit to the city, and as a city representatives, that all of you sit here today, that's where we are. We also talk about that what a city representative means, and it's everyone. So unpaid, paid, volunteer, committee, board, task force, all of our city leaders that have committed to serving the city in that capacity. We also talk about our personnel resolution policy here in the city. Understand that it prohibits any discrimination, and it lists here a lot of protected characteristics such as race, ethnicity, color, creed, so on and so forth, but it prohibits, not only is it illegal to discriminate based upon these protected characteristics, but it prohibits it altogether in our policies. Same with unwelcome sexual advances. So our personnel resolution policy also speaks to prohibiting sexual harassment, especially what you think about quid pro quo, tit for tat, like we're prohibiting all of that. And that applies to our staff folks and our leaders who are employees, as well as our leaders who serve on the boards like y'all. Finally, just to kind of round the corner, we have an EEO policy here in the city. I'm sure all of you are aware. It also prohibits discrimination in the hiring and employment. Any questions on that? Okay. And then we also think about everything that the city offers. So our city activities, facilities, services, trainings, they have to be available to everyone regardless of their protected characteristics as well. All right, respecting diversity in the workplace. We're rounding up our personnel policies. We expect for everyone to respect our leaders, employees here in the city, and there is a process for employees to take if they feel like they have been subjected to unlawful discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and all. For the city, we have a procedure in place that allows the city to investigate any internal complaints of discrimination, harassment, so on and so forth. So, cover the policies really quickly. I know y'all are familiar with those. Now, what about the law? So our federal, state, and also some local municipalities make it illegal to discriminate. And I'm sure that's just a reminder for everyone. That includes intentional discrimination and unintentional discrimination, even if something is neutral and it affects a group or groups differently. You heard me say protected characteristics a couple times. Just wanted to list some out. This is not an exhaustive list of protected characteristics, but these are the ones that we've seen come up more often in the last maybe like 5 years, so including the COVID period and kind of the uptick in that. It could be any or all of these things. We're going to kind of zero in on sexual harassment in some of the later slides, but understand that someone can be discriminated against, harassed, or have a hostile work environment created based upon any of these protected characteristics. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. Yes? Yes. You're talking about the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act down here at the bottom? Yes, so the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act, this has been a recent development where pregnant workers can request certain accommodations because of their status as a pregnant person. And there's also a similar one, the PUMP Act is for nursing folks. If they are postpartum and nursing, that it gives them the opportunity to request accommodations specific to that without it having to rise to a disability. So usually when folks, not usually, but sometimes when folks have a disability that affects their workplace, they will request some workplace accommodations, but pregnancy isn't a disability necessarily. Some pregnancies are straightforward and, uneventful. So these two acts help to create a space for pregnant people to request those accommodations without having to be laid up or on bed rest or something like that. All right. So discrimination is kind of our umbrella. Harassment falls under there as a form of discrimination. And in order to be unlawful harassment, it has to meet these 4 criteria. So it has to be related to the protected class, protected characteristics that we just discussed. It has to be unwelcome conduct, objectively and subjectively offensive. So offensive to that particular person, offensive to a reasonable person as well. And it has to be severe or pervasive, and we'll talk about those a little bit. Specifically, is the conduct unwelcome or unwanted? We talk a little bit about this when we are talking about okay, well, they didn't say anything back to me. They didn't say that that they were uncomfortable. It doesn't have to go that far. Silence does not mean that they have condoned the conduct. The complaining employee subjectively has to believe that it is unwelcome, and that is judged from the perspective of the employee. There's a little bit of a gray area if the employee initially condones it or solicited or invited the conduct. And so we will do a deeper dive and analysis of that if it comes to an internal investigation. But it is a gray area because someone can also, it can initially be welcome conduct and then transition into unwelcome conduct at some point. And that's what, if there is an internal investigation, that's what the internal investigation will dig deep to discover. Unwelcome conduct is still against city policy, so keep that in mind. And then we talk about our severe or pervasive. So it can be severe where we think about something that is overtly against the grain and outside of the realm of good leadership behavior. So we think about racial epithets with historical significance. We think about physical touching of folks. We think about things that are overtly in your face, absolutely wrong. It only takes one time if it's one of those. Now, if we have little mosquito bites is kind of how I think of it, where it's something every day. It's not a big deal. Like I could kind of go through my work day, even though they said that little slight, but it's happening daily. Then we would consider the nature of the conduct. This is the analysis that we will do during the internal investigation. The frequency of the conduct, like is it happening daily or does it just happen, at the summer meeting or something? The circumstances under which the conduct occurred, whether the conduct was physically threatening or humiliating, and most importantly, whether it interferes with the employee's work. I mean, the employee and everyone who works for the city, we're here to work for the city and execute the mission, right? And so if there's conduct or activities going on that distracts away from that and causes the employee to kind of take a sidestep to deal with that instead of dealing with, executing the vision, I mean, we're going to look at that too. Any questions about that? All right. So I have a slide for sex harassment. We're specifically for sex harassment. These are still unwelcome, but they're sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature. These are instances in which, so there's two kinds. There's quid pro quo and then just a general hostile work environment. So for the quid pro quo, we're talking about, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. So you do this, and I'll make sure you get your promotion. Or, on the flip side, if you don't do this for me, I'm going to make sure you do not get that promotion. I'm going to give it to the person who did it. So, and it could be scheduling. It could be days off. It could be scheduling, days off, promotions. It could be negative consequences like demotions, no bonus, et cetera, so on and so forth. What we're looking at, though, is this interfering with the person's work? I mean, that's going to be my underlying theme here. Like, I want employees to be able to do their work without interference from these other distractions. Any questions about that? Okay, so we talked about the quid pro quo. This is someone, supervisor, someone with some authority. It could be a city leader. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be their immediate supervisor up the chain of command. We're doing quid pro quo. If you do this, I'm going to do this for you. It's like, oh, remember, I have this city council person's ear, so make sure you do this. So we're conditioning some aspect of their employment on the favor that we're asking for, or the absence of action that we're asking for. On the other hand, and that happens, quid pro quo happens. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. It just doesn't. We don't see it as frequently as we do a hostile work environment. So this is, and again, think of it as little mosquito bites. We're dropping a sexually explicit joke, and someone else overhears. We're saying some suggestive remarks. We're giving some unwanted touching where it's not necessarily touching private parts, but if they don't want the hug, they don't want the hug, you know. Inquiring into personal lives. We are at work, and again, we don't want to distract from people executing the mission. So for some folks, inquiring into their personal lives is a step too far. And I'll give you an example. We had a situation where it was a supervisor and a subordinate, and they did not know each other before working together. They're not friends. They're not close. They don't, when it hits 5 o'clock, I don't know when they got off, but when it hits 5 o'clock, they go their separate ways. The supervisor thought it was a good idea to get to know his subordinate, so he starts asking questions. Are you dating anyone? Like, does that, Are you dating anyone? How is it being a single parent? Do you get to go out on the weekends since you're a single parent? Who watches your kids when you go out? I mean, you can see where I'm going with this. Like, I think he had good intentions, but it just did not have to do with the work that they had to do there. So it doesn't go as far as to ask, you also discuss sex life, doesn't go that far, but for that particular employee, the power dynamic made it land on her like he was trying to be romantically involved. And I don't think he was trying to be quite frank, but that's how it landed. And so she was distracted from the work that she was doing for a while because this was an ongoing thing where every time they would come back into the workroom, he would ask questions like this. And I believe that he was just trying to get to know her better, but it went a step too far for that. Also talk about explicit text, emails, cartoons, jokes. Sharing memes are the thing, or TikTok videos. I'm a little aged, but sharing them is a thing, and they are funny, and, for some employees, that may be a step too far. So just thinking about how those actions land on the person who's receiving it. I also think about, again, with the mosquito bites, like this may be a mosquito bite for me, and it may not be a mosquito bite for the next person. So also thinking about that, because when we're thinking about discrimination and harassment, it falls on the individual employee. Any questions about that? Okay. And again, I mentioned that it's not just sex harassment. We've kind of did a little deeper dive there, but it's not just sex harassment. We also think about harassment based upon pregnancy status, harassment based upon gender expression, identity, thinking about anything like that. It could be any protected characteristic, national origin, folks who have English as a second language. Like, can you imagine being asked most days, like, do you really speak English? Really, where are you from? Like, it comes to be a lot. Like, one question maybe, it's like, okay, I can let that slide. But if someone or your department is asking over and over again, it becomes a lot, and it becomes really distracting for the employee. Okay, did you know you're taking a pop quiz this morning? It's probably not even 10 o'clock. All right, let's test our knowledge. True or false? A victim of harassment must have been the recipient of the inappropriate conduct and not merely a witness to it. Call it out at me. False. So we think about this, and I'll give you this example. It's a group of guys, they're just kind of palling around in the workplace, like at a manufacturing facility or something, and they are having locker room talk. Like, they're close, they're talking about lots of stuff that should have stayed in the group chat, but here they are. Someone walks by and overhears it, and it's way outside of the realm of what needs to be discussed at work. The person who overheard it was offended and reported it. And there's a whole internal investigation, and you didn't say anything to the person who was just walking by, third person walking by and overheard it, but that counts too. It's at the workplace. If they hear it, you know, that may bother them, and it may be distracting for them in doing the work that they do. Any questions on that? Okay. True or false? A board member cannot be held liable for harassment because board members are not the employer. Oh, thank y'all. Y'all are just great. False, okay. We'll talk a little later about how acting outside of the scope of your role can lead to individual liability and risk for board members. So this is absolutely false. You can be held liable. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the rest of our time today. True or false? A consensual relationship between a board member and employee is not a problem. Ooh, gotta look quieter. Okay, so I'm gonna say false. I think it's a little bit of a gray area. Hear me out. If we're thinking about board members and leaders of the city, y'all have power, perceived power, and actual power. And so there's a little bit of a power dynamic difference in the board members, leaders of the city, and the employees. I think it may be a little different. Some of the things that we kind of came up yesterday, if you serve on a board and the employee has nothing to do with the board that you serve on, maybe a gray area. But the thing that we want to think about is, what if the situation, relationship, whatever it is, or y'all dating, what if they get tired of you and they're like, okay, now it wasn't consensual? I mean, you're kind of stuck there, right? So that's why I think we need to give some thought if this is where we're heading, because there could be some risk here for y'all as board members, okay? So true or false, a person's provocative manner of dress is relevant to whether sexual advances are welcome. False. No one's asking for it, but it may be a violation of the dress code. It may be, but it doesn't encourage welcome or otherwise sexual advances. True or false, it's not illegal to make racist jokes or comments about your own race. It's false. It's absolutely false. We don't get a pass. Just because it's not offensive to me doesn't mean it's not offensive to the next person. And it's work. Like, again, we're trying not to distract folks from executing our mission here at the city. So, talked about a lot of rules, policies, laws. They all apply to our elected officials, so our council members, representatives of the city, including y'all fine folks, all of the employees, third parties, like, so let's think about contractors that come in, customers, members of the public, vendors. And the example that I use here is if a vendor every day is coming in and telling your receptionist or whomever that commenting on her body every day, and she feels uncomfortable with it, and she comes to, chain of command to one of you or whatever have you, and she's like, I'm really uncomfortable with this one particular vendor coming in. I mean, it becomes the city's problem. Like, we have to investigate, we have to make sure that our employees are not subjected to those little mosquito bites, which may ultimately become a hostile work environment, right? I also think about members of the public. That we know that every single member of the public is not operating with their adult brain most of the time, and so they may say something untoward towards you, and maybe one time it's fine for the employee, the next 6 times, maybe not. So again, the theme is we want our employees to be able to do the work. And if every day someone's coming in and they're bothering our employee or commenting on their body or touching their hair, it could be anything, and the employee is uncomfortable with it and they report it, that's the city's problem. Now, the standards for liability differ for who's doing the alleged harassing. We've got strict liability for our management and our leaders. So individual liability, potentially, for management and leaders. Again, if we're operating outside of the scope of our role as leaders in the city, we've gone rogue. There's definitely maybe individual liability for us. And so when we're litigating this, we go with the new or should have known standard. So the city is responsible for what it indeed does know. The city is also responsible for what it should have known because it was so obvious. Any questions on that?
What's the difference between strict and individual liability?
So if you're a leader or a leader for the city or management level, your knowledge is imputed to the city. So if they're saying that manager X is sexually harassing his subordinate, the city's going to be strictly liable for that because he is an actor for the city, an agent for the city. As opposed to if it was just a rank and file employee, that we could just say, employee's gone rogue, discipline, but it's not the city's action. So the city isn't strictly liable. Did you want to add to that? I saw you adjusted mic.
Yes, I was trying to find the on button. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
It's on.
Think of it in these terms. Again, as Dina indicated, the information or the actions of the leaders, supervisors, are basically imputed to the city, and it's almost like saying, because that person is in that particular role, city, you are automatically liable for that. There are certain defenses we might be able to present, but for the most part, the city will be deemed automatically liable for that, as opposed to a different situation where it's an individual employee versus employee, where you kind of look at the totality of the situation and determine whether the city knew or should have known what had occurred, and therefore, if it knew, it's responsible for it. Does that help? Okay.
And where do these rules apply? So definitely at the workplace. Work events off premises. Yep, go ahead and nod your head with me. Anywhere while working and interacting with colleagues, a little bit of gray area, we might do some analysis there. Off premises without any official city sponsorship or work. It could be. So think about it like this. So colleagues go out, no, they don't even go out together. They just happen to end up at the same bar, nightclub, whatever like that. Something happens. The next day, employee has now, I'm going to use my colleague's example, they packed it up with their lunch and their tuna fish, and they brought it to work with them because it was still bothering them. I mean, it kind of lands in the city's lap at that point, because now they're at work with the person that they had this, I don't even know what happened, but had an interaction with that was not okay. So how about off-duty altogether? So I don't, please take my little tuna fish, pack it up in your lunch example. I'm going to use that example again. If we're packing it up and bringing it to work and it's affecting the work relationships, again, we want to make sure that folks can do this work, the employees can do this work without distraction. And if they're saying, hey, I don't know if I could work with this person anymore because of what happened, I mean, that falls in the city's lap. I mean, at that point, we need to do our internal investigation and see if there's some action that we need to take. Any questions about that? Yeah. I'm going to defer to the city attorney for that.
There is not at this time a specific policy regarding that, but it would still fall in the general policy regarding bullying, and so it would be prohibited. So.
All right, taking a little sidestep into microaggressions. So this is a topic that has come up more and has been discussed more in the last several years, I would say. These microaggressions are the things that we talk about when we think about little mosquito bites. My colleague often says death by 1,000 cuts. So like, again, one instance may not throw you off your game as an employee. Every day may be a lot for that employee. So these are brief everyday exchanges that send messages to most of the time marginalized groups, but it could really be anybody. And it's typically unintentional, and so it's a little harder to address in that respect. We have a couple of forms of microaggressions, and so if you see in the left column, those are what, quote unquote old-fashioned racism, overt discrimination. This is deliberate. So this is a very simple example, but kind of like a Southerner saying, bless your heart, where it sounds nice, but you know what they meant. So thinking about racial or misogynistic epithets, refusing service based upon sexual orientation. So this is in your face, straightforward, like I'm doing it. It's not something that, I'm not punching you in the face, I'm not doing that, but I could slip this in there. And it's still gonna impact the person who receives it. In the middle column, micro insults. So this is subtle. This is way more subtle than the overt overt conduct. The harm is unintentional. So the intent is not to harm the other person, but that may be the impact that it creates. So we think of, you are a credit to your race. The rest of that sentence, because all the rest of them are terrible. like the silent part of the sentence is kind of where the problem lies. So the other one on this, just going back to that last slide, so like, what are you? And we hear that sometimes, directed toward non-binary people, people whose race isn't readily apparent on their face. Also think about the second picture, why do you sound white? And some of us have heard this, or you're such a great writer. It's like, what is the rest of that sentence? Like, I don't, yeah. You don't look Jewish. You don't look Indian. You don't look Chinese. Like, think of the impact that it has on the person that receives it. So, again, harm is unintentional. Like, the person's not out to get you. But it's a slight. Same as the micro invalidations. Again, unintentional. But it seems to exclude the person to whom it's directed. So kind of like gaslighting. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be offended by that. I just gave you a compliment. It's like, get over it. You're over it. Dina's always overreacting over this. I am. But Dina's always overreacting over this stuff. The one example, I say the bottom bullet, this is an actual example. So 2 Black employees, they're with the marketing, not here, private company marketing department. The rest of their department is mostly white. The supervisor is white. And they keep transposing these 2 women's names. So one's Deidre, and one's, I think her other name was Wilma. And eventually, they were just like, oh, we'll just create a name for you both. And we'll just call you both whatever, a combination of the 2 names. And that's what they call them, referring to them collectively or referring to them as individuals. And what message does that send? You're not even important enough for me to remember your name, friend. And this is your supervisor. Like, that's not okay, 1. But 2, it invalidates that person's experience. Like, I think for most people, you feel really unimportant if someone didn't take the time to remember your name when you've been working there for a while. So that's another one. So they're not setting out to offend, but the impact of the statements or the actions have that result. Any questions about that? Okay. Other examples. Telling a woman she's bossy in some instances. Saying you're so articulate to a person of color, because what's the rest of that sentence? As compared to your peers. So scheduling important deadlines on a religious or cultural holiday. If we know, why are we emailing this person when we know that they're celebrating their holiday? Claiming you have OCD, ADHD, it minimizes the experience of the people who are actually working with that and have diagnoses. And this has come up, I guess, a little bit more recently, where people will just throw out like, oh, I'm so ADHD, I don't remember anything. I was like, oh, or your coworker is actually struggling with that, but she can't even say anything because now she feels like you're gonna minimize her experience and how hard it is for her to show up every day. Asking questions such as, where are you from? No, where are you really from? That's offensive. Touching someone's hair or continually commenting how unique someone's hair is. If you've never been othered in your workplace, this is one of those. First, please don't touch anyone's hair. Can I throw that out there? Just don't touch anyone's hair. Personal space and all of that. But also, we don't want people to feel excluded. Like if we're always talking about, oh, your hair's always different. And we always have to comment on it, and we're not really noticing whether our counterpart whom we're talking to, whether we've noticed that they've kind of shrunk back, or they're not responding, or they've shut down in the conversation. If we're not taking note of that, and they're not they're not receptive to whatever we're saying, I mean, that's on us as leaders and supervisors, managers. The resulting internal dilemmas, and so this is for the recipient of the microaggressions. So think of little mosquito bites every day. It's distracting. They go through, did I interpret that correctly? Am I overreacting? What did he or she mean by that? Should I say something? I might make it worse if I do. Speaking up is gonna hurt more. These are all of the questions folks go through. And guess what they're not talking about? The work that they're here to do. So we've taken them outside of the very critical work that the city needs and put them in this place where they're ruminating on these little slights that have added up over time. And we also talk about, if this goes on for a period of time, I mean, we know people who have had work hurts where they've had to quit jobs, and that costs the city money to recruit and retain. So they're quitting jobs, they have anxiety about coming to work, they're paranoid that this is just gonna happen every day and no one's gonna listen, lack of confidence, so on and so forth. I mean, these are things that I also think about workers' comp claims, leave for mental health reasons, and all of this kind of, if we're not thinking about the attentiveness to others or anything like that, I mean, hear me out. That's a lot of risk money for the city if these employees keep churning and we've created a space where employees don't feel safe here. It also, think about the workers' comp claims. Think about the potential for litigation for the city. And all of this costs money that the city could be using for other very important missions. Exactly. She said, what's your name? Tony. Tony said also, just to add, that we're losing talent. So if we recruited someone for a role, we want them in that role, right? If they're doing a good job. And if they all of a sudden leave, we've lost that talent for the city. So thinking about that too. All right, what are we gonna do about it? These are things. I'm gonna start with the right-hand column, because as leaders, this is probably where we may fall. So employee comes up to you or maybe your colleague comes up to you and they're like, hey, look, when you said X, Y, Z, that really offended me, and I was still mad when I woke up this morning. What do we do? Like that's an awkward conversation to have. And I don't want to minimize how awkward it is to have a conversation like that. It's hard. So initially, I want people to pause and breathe, because your first thing is like, I didn't mean it like that. Like this, at least that's mine. My knee-jerk reaction is like, if someone comes up to me and they're like, hey, what you said offended me. I didn't mean it like that. Wait, why did you interpret it like that? And I think as leaders, what I would like you to do is to pause and let them talk, listen, be authentic, own it. If you said it, own it. Reflect, apologize. I love an apology, a sincere, authentic apology. But just, I'm sorry. Like, I had no idea that offended you. Ask for help on how not to repeat the behavior, if appropriate. That if someone comes up to you, they're like, hey, you touched my hair yesterday. I don't want that to happen again. Please don't ask them for help how to not repeat it. Just don't touch their hair. But on the other hand, like, there are situations where it completely blew by you. And you're like, whoa, like, I had absolutely no idea this was offensive. Help me out, please, if appropriate. Because if that person is screaming and spitting, please don't ask for help. But if they're coming to you and trying to earnestly work out and have that conversation to move the working relationship forward, that's a valid question. Like, hey, I had no idea this was offensive. Like, I didn't even know that it was historically offensive. I was asleep. I don't know where I was when this was decided. Please help me understand. Are there other phrases, words, terms that I'm supposed to omit because they are offensive to a certain group of people? On the other side, my example is always like, I completely misgendered someone. And they came up to me at a later time. It wasn't even the next day. It was at a later time, and was like, hey, this is really just hadn't really been sitting right with me. Like, you misgendered me this day. You didn't circle back to it. What's up with that? And I had to fall on my sword. Like, I fell on my sword. And I had to say, I'm so sorry that was not my intent, but I misstepped. Absolutely misstepped. And we had a relationship such that, we had a conversation about what to do going forward. And it was super helpful for me. This happened years ago, and it was super, super helpful for me so that I didn't misstep like that again with someone else or with the same person. Try not to repeat it. Like, if someone's coming up to you, like, that takes a lot of courage to come up and say, yo, you offended me, and not be spitting and mad. Like, take time to pivot from the action or the word. If someone's coming up to you and they're like, hey, can you not say this particular phrase because it's really offensive to Black folks? And you're like, sure. And then at the next meeting you say it, that doesn't create that type of environment that we want to create here at the city. Again, we all have biases. I told y'all, like I don't misstep all the time, but I definitely misstep. And I want folks to be able to come to me and let me know. Like if I'm if I'm not doing things correctly, or if I'm offending folks, like I want to know. Like don't leave me in the dark now. And so, but I have to be open to that feedback, be curious about, you know, folks that are different from me and their experience, their very true, real lived experience. Any questions about that?
Dina, for the misstep you just described.
Yes.
In your conversation with that person, did that person have a suggestion as to how to identify that person going forward? If you stated it, I'm sorry, I missed it.
No, yes, they did. So we had a conversation about, like, my question at the time was, if I don't know the person's pronouns or gender when listening or speaking to them, like face to face, how do I address them? I want to be respectful. I don't want to be out here calling folks who are old enough to be my grandma their first name. Like, tell me what to do. Not tell me what to do, but, like, help me out. And the solution for that, for me in my role, was they said, ask. It's like, hey, I'm Dina. What are your pronouns? 2, in emails, I use first names if I don't know, as greetings. And then when talking on the phone, I kind of wing it, and I wait for them to use however they want to be addressed. So those were my 3 yeah. So, and it doesn't happen as often, but it does happen. I mean, I'm on the phone with someone and they have a neutrally neutral name and a neutrally neutral voice. I'm like, okay, I cannot even tell your age. I'm trying to be respectful, so we're gonna call you Ryan. Ryan is the name. So, any questions about that? I mean, that was my misstep. I'll follow my sword for that. So, on the flip side, someone says something untoward to us. So now we're sitting here with, you know, ruminating over it, or with hurt feelings or upset. I mean, however it lands in you, to address the person who said it. And I don't want to minimize how much courage it takes to do that, to address something directly. Like, that is not a simple feat. They've already offended you. Like, it's not easy to go and to the person who's already offended you and say, look, you've offended me. Why'd you say that? Like, that takes some courage. And so when we're addressing the person who said it, my little phrase is, what did you mean by that? And I'm understanding that I can do this in real time. So someone says, ha, 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 all black people, blah, 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 blah. What do you mean by that? What's going on here? And it really creates an uncomfortable space for the person who threw that out there. But it could, in some instances, invite a conversation. It's like, hey, that's not cool. Like, you lumped us all together. I need you not to go down that path again. Like, this is the last time I want to have this conversation. But that's me, because I'm a little aggressive. But for other folks who are not so aggressive, thinking about, you know, if it's someone that you're close to at work and they said something, you're like, dang, that really makes me mad, because I never thought that my close coworker friend would say anything like that. And I think, 4th bullet, you know, we're having a different conversation then. Like, this is not a stranger. This is someone you work closely with, someone you may like. You may have been to your house, and you're very thrown off by a comment that they made. And in that case, I would have a different conversation. I'd be like, hey, you know, mine is in my feelings. I've been in my feelings for 3 days over something that you said, and I need to have a conversation about it. Different conversation than stranger person for me, where it's like, what do you mean? What are you thinking? Why would you say that? Like, that's a different conversation. And the last one, I don't necessarily do this, because it's usually people that are my senior or older than I am, so I don't try to walk them down the path of good language at work. But if you have the opportunity and you feel led to do so, I would like you to consider this going forward. Understand that there are some folks that don't even go to the person who said it. They'll go straight to HR. So just thinking about that as well, because if you say something and it lands in such a way that they're like, I can't even address this, they'll go straight to HR. And so these are examples. This is just a framework. Remix it how you like for your personality, okay?
Dina, can I make a few comments?
Absolutely.
Let me say I appreciate the conversation we're having and the openness of the questions, but I think for me, what I'm hearing in the questions that are being asked is maybe a lack of understanding in terms of the difference between the workplace and home or other venues. I understand folks want to sometimes bring into the workplace the conversations they may have outside the workplace, but keep in mind that the workplace should be about work, and there is a certain type of dialogue and there are expectations in terms of how conversations occur in the workplace. And those are vastly different from what may happen at home or outside of work. And so if you think of it in that framework or in that context, the information here should be helpful.
Okay, we're gonna do this one last topic and then we'll take a break. Is that okay? Okay. So we also talk about workplace bullying because that also happens more often than we think. And so when we're thinking about abusive conduct in the workplace, this is with malice, this is on purpose, it's not like our microaggressions, they're actually out to get you. That a reasonable person will find hostile, offensive, and unrelated to the employer's legitimate business interest. Again, outside of the scope of what we're here to do. Thinking about what it looks like. It's repeatedly using derogatory marks, insults, and epithets toward an employee or a leader at work. Verbal or physical conduct that a reasonable person would find threatening, intimidating, or humiliating. And we'll talk about some of those on the next slide. And sabotaging a person's work performance. I mean, how does that contribute or add to executing the mission if we're sabotaging someone? So we think about bullying behaviors. One is shouting. Like if someone's screaming at work, okay, just hear me out. We're at work. I'm on my computer sending all of these emails, and someone comes to me screaming about something that's misplaced at work. Like, we don't need that at work. It definitely throws someone off of their task, distracting toward the mission. Gossiping about others, consistently gossiping about an employee, just thinking about how distracting that would be for that employee to execute the mission if they're hearing stuff about them, personal life, or whatever it may be. Taking credit for someone else's work consistently. The silent treatment. The other one that we talked about, I think, in one of the other trainings, is if every time someone speaks in a business meeting or work group or whatever like that, that someone leans back, they do this, and lean back and cross their arms. Every time? Like that's not okay, one. But it rises to the level of that intentional conduct, because how are you doing that at that exact moment every time that person speaks, right? Foul language, pranks, mean pranks. The one example that we've used is supervisor has an employee, they've onboarded new employee starts first day, and then at the end of the day, the supervisor played a prank on that new employee and fake fired them. I'm like, what? So, I mean, that's a lot. We're at work. Okay, just level set. We're at work. That's a lot for someone. Can you imagine all the emotions that they went through and how distracting that would be for the next day to come back knowing your whole team knows that this prank has been played on you? Like, that's a lot. And that's a real example that actually happened, that the supervisor was no longer employed there. Consistently excluding a team member from meetings and not including them on the meeting invite. All of these things in the aggregate, because, we're not yelling at someone every day. Maybe. I'm hoping no one's yelling at someone every day. But if we're yelling at them on Monday, on Tuesday and Wednesday, we don't invite them to the meeting. On Thursday, we spread a rumor about them that they're sleeping with so-and-so. And on Friday, no one talks to them deliberately. No one talks to them. And we're all in office. That's a hard week for that employee. And these are the kinds of behaviors that our policies prohibit. Like, we don't want anyone to feel bullied at work. Any questions on that? Interesting statistics. This is for bullying. They said 35% of American workers reported being bullied now or at some time in their career. But the interesting statistic is that 40% never tell their employers. So they've quit, they've moved on, they've started doing the bare minimum at work, they're not contributing to other activities. I mean, because they don't want to say out loud, like, I'm being bullied, not because of my race, not because of my gender or my sexual orientation. They're just bullying me, just straight up bullying me. And they never tell. And we lose talent. It quashes the teamwork for certain departments and how the teams work together. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing. And it's not new, but I think employers just started looking at it like within the last several years, like, hey, we need to prevent this too, like in addition to discrimination, harassment, so on and so forth. The effects of abusive conduct at work. Okay, so take that employee in that week that I just gave the example for. If that employee came back and decided to do something about it, I mean, this happens. It has happened at private workplaces, public, municipal workplaces. People are feeling like they're backed into a corner because they don't think the behavior is going to change and they don't have the flexibility to quit their job. Medical and workers' compensation claims, stress, high blood pressure, mental health, panic attacks. These are some of the things that people have reported based upon some of these bullying conduct that we've seen in the past. And we've already talked about, being basically forced to quit because they didn't have any other option. They were like, either I continue with the bullying or I've got to go. So we're going to go into our section on retaliation. So we've talked about discrimination, harassment, and microaggressions, workplace bullying, and now we're going to drop down to retaliation. Retaliation, again, this is unlawful as against our federal and state statutes. It's also against our policies, our city policies. So if a person makes a complaint of unlawful discrimination or harassment, we cannot retaliate against them. If they assist someone else in putting forth a complaint, we can't retaliate against them. If a person participates in an internal investigation as a witness, we can't retaliate against them. So from the city's perspective, what we need if there is an adverse action against an employee who participates in or initiates an internal investigation, we need a legitimate business reason to do so. And if the timing is such that it's really close to their report, we need to have a good articulable reason as to why we're taking that action so close to their report. So in the city's ethics policy, again, we prohibit retaliation, but more importantly, the city's ethics policies goes a step further and says that we want to even encourage folks to bring this forward to the city, to allow the city an opportunity to complete that internal investigation and figure out what's going on. Because, people report a lot of things. I'm sure your HR and wonderful city attorney could tell you. there's going to be many things that are unsubstantiated after an internal investigation. So I encourage, I know the policy does, but I encourage everyone, we'll talk a little later about if someone brings a complaint to you as board members and leaders, but I encourage everyone just to let the city's already established procedures go through the internal processes to make sure that the city's doing everything they need to do in response. In our personnel resolution policy, there's also an anti-retaliation provision. The personnel resolution policy, again, gives employees the opportunity to use any and all existing grievance processes and procedures without fear of coercion or reprisal. Again, anti-retaliation, it's all over our policies. Thinking about what do acts of retaliation even include? So this is threats. So someone reports something, or they say they're going to report something. They're like, if you report that, I promise you, you're not getting a bonus this year. I mean, that's a threat. It doesn't have to be a physical threat. Reprimands, so written disciplinary actions, whatever that looks like. Negative job evaluations, so for annual and mid-year reviews. Any adverse treatment, and so that's a catch-all for, getting a not desirable schedule, no raise, move to a not desirable team. Like, it really could be anything in our analysis as to whether or not is a step down, even if the pay doesn't change. And of course, termination. So we're thinking about just grand picture. Anything that would dissuade a reasonable person from bringing or pursuing a claim. Because again, in our policies, the city wants to encourage folks to bring these claims forward or these complaints forward. So anything that's going to discourage that kind of falls under those acts of retaliation for the employees. Any questions on that? All right, practical tips. Okay, we've learned all this. What are we doing here? As leaders, my first request of you, I've actually had a lot of requests today, so ongoing list of requests. Gut check your own conduct. So again, I mentioned before, we all have biases. We all have blind spots. Every single person in this room, no matter how much training you do or participated in, we all have blind spots. So being aware of that, knowing that we have those blind spots, just accept it. It's a thing. Others hold y'all as leaders of the city on a pedestal. So you have this perceived and actual power as leaders in the city. So are we taking advantage of that? How would a complete stranger judge your behavior? So mine is employees have the opportunity to pursue administrative remedies, like filing a charge with the EEOC if they feel like they've been discriminated against or harassed. Do you want your name and what you said to be written up for the federal government to review? No. That's my barometer. My colleague's barometer is, would your grandmother be proud to read about it on the front page of the paper? Because as a municipality, those public records requests, they have limitations, but the press does a lot with a little. So, and just silence does not mean consent. If we're talking to someone and we say something and they kind of shut down, get quiet, and we notice it, that doesn't mean that they've condoned whatever we said if it was something that was unwelcome or conduct that wasn't welcome. So just keep that in mind as leaders as well. Sometimes folks will not respond or react in the moment because of your position as leaders in the city. Consider the consequences. So coming full circle here, there's legal liability for harassment. We've talked about that. Criminal charges in some cases, if it rises to that. Personal impact. Think about psychological ramifications if you're accused. It's a lot. It's a lot to go through. Personal financial impact. So what if the accusation is sustained and the city has to take action? That may mean a loss of job, a demotion. Also that if you're outside of the scope of your duties as a leader, the city may not indemnify and defend. So you may be on the hook for grabbing your own legal counsel. I will mention again, expensive. So we're going to avoid that. And then reputational damage and career ruin. This happens. I'm sure you've heard about folks who have been accused of discrimination, harassment, retaliation, who have absolutely lost their jobs because of it, because it was substantiated by their employer. So we don't want that to happen, which is the reason for kind of these reminders in the reset. But I do want to just point out, you know, my expectation of the folks in this room is that that won't happen. And so our next section is just how to be an inclusive leader. So this is, like, our first section is how to avoid liability, basically. But how can we, on the other hand, go the other direction? Like, how can we do better from where we are? So some key takeaways on being an inclusive leader. Seek to understand before being understood. We've talked a little bit previously about just listening. Showing up, thinking how the leader you would want to be would show up. So as your best leader self. Include diverse perspectives and values in the city and our organization's notion of success. Knowing that everyone, employees' differences contribute to the overall vision and goal. Invite the authentic connections. We talked about being, I think the word used was genuine. Invite those genuine connections. We had a very great discussion offline about how we have those genuine conversations, so when someone does, or authentic connections, so when someone does misstep, we feel like we have the space to say, what you mean by that, friend? Like, what's going on? Lead with courage and vulnerability, empathize and be curious. Just specifically to the courage piece, it takes a lot to step outside of the big old snowball rolling downhill. It is much easier to allow that snowball to keep rolling. And I know as we sit here today, I won't ask for examples, but I know everyone has an example that pops into mind of something that's happened over the tenure of your leadership with the city, where you're like, yep, that was the microaggression that she was talking about. Yep, happened to me. Or, yep, that was the hostile work environment. Experienced that too. Maybe not here, and maybe at another employer. But it takes courage to interrupt that. And I want to underscore that the easy thing is to let it continue and to sweep it under the rug. Mine is put it on the shelf. I put it in a pretty bow and I put it on the shelf when I don't want to deal with things. The harder thing is to address it. And so that's addressing it one-on-one, that's addressing it in some of our work sessions. Y'all still have work sessions, right? Addressing it in some of the work sessions or just in the work that we do to make sure that we're addressing it. And that doesn't mean necessarily calling someone out in front of a group. I just want to say that too. Like, I mean, there is a place for that. But initially, if we're just having one initial conversation, it seems like the more helpful thing to do would be to have a one-on-one conversation. And again, my example before, if we have that conversation and the person's like, "Bet, I got you, like, this will not happen again." And the next meeting it happens again, he might get called out there. Yep. And that might be more effective the second time or the third time. But the first time, it seems like, we have to have those one-on-one conversations and directly address it in that way. Your responsibilities as leaders. I'm going to start at the bottom. Know your role and stay in your lane. We talk about individual liability. We need to be in our lane in order to avoid that. Taking action if you become aware of inappropriate behavior. Action. Set expectations for appropriate behavior around you. Again, if you're in a group of people as a leader of the city and you're allowing them to make untoward remarks and you just ignore it, like, they know you hear it. You don't giggle, body language is not contributing, but they know that they can say it around you, they will continue to say it around you. And then, of course, modeling appropriate behavior. So all of the discrimination, harassment, workplace bullying, we're not doing that. We're above that, all of that. So walking the tightrope. So again, if you exceed your duties, you're outside of your lane, you're doing someone else's job, I don't know how y'all want to put it, you run the risk of personal liability. And what that means, again, is that the city may not indemnify you and defend. So that, and thus, you have to get your own attorney, which is expensive. You may be held financially liable, also expensive. So I think when we talk about personal liability, and I'm talking about monetary damages right now, that does not address, the damage to your career, the fact that you may have to find a new job, the fact that you're going to have to deal with this outside of work with your family, to the extent you have one, so on and so forth. However, if you stay in your lane, you have certain immunity protections. So, what are our areas of greatest risks? Inserting yourself in personnel matters is a no-no. And that's not saying employees won't come to you, and we'll talk about that in a bit, in a couple slides. But if we're inserting ourselves, we're following up with HR to see if that person was disciplined, like that's outside of our lane. Talking about personnel matters involving public employees. There's certain statutes that protect personnel information for our employees here at the city. If you're found in violation of them, there's civil liability, but there's also criminal liability as a misdemeanor. Involving yourself in any litigation the city's involved in. If you're not a person that needs to know, a witness, the city attorney has contacted you for information, we're out, hands off. We have someone who does a fabulous job litigating for the city, and we're gonna let her do her job so that we stay in our lane and do our job. We talked about personnel matters. So this is how it comes back to bite you. So it's 160A-168, knowingly disseminating personnel information. That is a misdemeanor if you're found in violation of that. But employees may still come to you, again, like your leaders in the city, if they feel like they're not being heard, if they have worked with you in another capacity and so they see you as a person that they can speak with. We here want the takeaway to be, what's your role if an employee comes to you and they're like, hey, my example from yesterday was, hey, I have seen, witnessed, understand that there are several OSHA violations out in my field. I have spoken to a couple of people about it in my chain of command, but we're still in violation of the standards. Can you help? We're going to say, so yes, but we're not doing the investigating as leaders. We're passing that on to HR, city attorney, city manager. If they come to you, they've already stepped outside of the chain of command. They've already kind of exited the highway there. So we want to make sure that it gets to the correct person, even if they say that they're going to report it. We already know at that point, because our knowledge as leaders is imputed, to the city. So we're responsible for the knowledge that we have. It's in our lap now. And then if we don't kind of bump that up to our city attorney, city manager, HR, after receiving the information, it, again, can lead to individual liability because the city may not indemnify and defend because they're like, you had a duty to go ahead and send this up. Or it subjects the city to liability. Because what is the saying? The employee's going to say, well, I told the city about the OSHA violations. I told the city that I was being harassed by my supervisor. They're like, who did you tell? My board member. And you're named. And so that falls in your lap. Any questions about that? All right. So how do we receive these complaints while staying in our lane? So employee comes up to you, let's use my OSHA example. Employee comes up to you and they're like, hey, I've had issues because I know that there's OSHA or I believe that there's OSHA violations out in the field where I work. I've talked to a couple people about it in my chain of command. The violations are still ongoing. I don't know what to do at this point. What's our response as leaders? We need to listen. gather the information. It doesn't have to be a long conversation. Thank them for bringing it to us. Let them know that we will get them to get their complaint to HR, city manager, or the city attorney. We can't promise complete anonymity. In order to do an fair internal investigation, we're going to have to talk to everybody, including the accused, and witnesses if there are witnesses. Like, we're going to have to talk to everybody. So we can't promise complete anonymity or confidentiality. What we can promise is that it will only be distributed or disseminated to the people who need to know. We can't agree to not act. So another example, real life example, employee comes up to, I guess this is district manager, couple levels up. Employee, this is a private company, employee comes up to district manager and they're like, look, my supervisor and I were at a conference, a work conference, and he touched my breast at the bar, through my clothes. It was not welcome. We've never dated. I don't know what to do. The person taking the report was like, hey, okay, that's fine. We'll start an internal investigation. Employee, no. I don't want to do anything. I just wanted to let someone know. And the employer, to my dismay, said, okay, and we can't do that. So if the information comes to the city, we have an obligation to do the internal investigation and go through our procedures. Because, on the flip side of that, if we don't, I mean, we have liability there. Because what is the employee going to say? I told them we have procedures. They didn't even follow them. Nothing happened. And that's what we don't want to have happen. So, again, employee comes to you. They're like, hey, I'm having this issue. I don't really want to do anything about it. I just needed to talk to somebody. We can't have an action there. Like, we need to say to them, it's like, I appreciate it. These are my next steps. I'm sending it to HR, city attorney, city manager, because I want to make sure that the city investigates this. As leaders, board members, we're not the investigators. So in that conversation, if it's an in-person conversation with the employee, we don't need to ask, where did that happen? No. We're just taking information, whatever they offer, by listening, and we're turning it over so that the procedures can be followed for the internal investigation. I'm taking that burden off of y'all. Y'all do not have to investigate anything. Welcome. We also want to, again, we have anti-retaliation provisions. We've already talked about that. If they're concerned about that, because a lot of employees will be concerned about that, whether there's a real threat of that or not, to let them know that the anti-retaliation provisions are in our policies, and if they feel like they've been retaliated against, HR is the proper department to go to. Any questions on that?
If I can, if you have that situation, what I would hope that you would do as leaders is to let that person know they should go to HR, city attorney's office, or the city manager's office, and then you as a leader should send an email to either the city attorney's office, my office, the city manager's office, or HR, basically detailing the conversation that was had and what you told the employee, just in case the employee decides not to follow your direction and go to one of those departments. Because because you have been informed of, or this information has been shared with you, the city has a responsibility now to investigate that. So if they don't follow up, that doesn't get the city off the hook. You need to share that information with one of those departments so we can conduct the investigation even if the employee doesn't follow through. Is that clear? Okay.
And it can be, for the employee, I'll say for the employees who are like, I don't really want to take this any further, just kind of playing it out. You report it, or you send your email to HR, the city attorney, or city manager, and you're like, hey, this is what was reported to me. I let them know X, Y, Z. And and then, someone from the city follows up to initiate that internal investigation with the employee may refuse to provide any information. And that's just an unsubstantiated complaint. But that's not on your shoulders, so you don't have to carry that. All we have to do is get the information where it needs to go in the city so that the city can at least attempt to do that internal investigation. Okay, so we talked about HR, city manager, city attorney. Another person that may be a resource that you can send this information to is the city staff person assigned to your particular board. They're a good resource as well. Camille French, who is the assistant city attorney over human resources, and then, of course, our city attorney. So those are just some other outlets, like if you feel like I'm closer with city staff person assigned to my board, I'll just go ahead and relay the information there and send that email and let it go, to the correct person there. Human resources may be a good resource as well. We talked about a little bit, there's no off-the-record complaints. Because you are leaders in the city, your knowledge is imputed to the city, we have that obligation to follow through. The one thing that I ask is when we're listening, there are some complaints that are outlandish, and as soon as the words leave their lips, you're like, nope, we can't make any commentary on that. We're just listening, even if it's just no chance at all that this would be substantiated. We still have to turn over the information. We still have to allow the city to go through their procedures. Hopefully, at the end, it's not substantiated and, your suspicion was correct. But in that initial conversation with the employee, they don't need to know that. All they need to know is that their leader listened to them, they passed on the information, and that the city has an anti-retaliation provision. And also talking about delay. We mentioned this in individual liability for board members, but we want to get this information to the correct people as soon as possible. We've seen situations, I'll say in my practice, where there's been a delay in getting it to HR, and so instead of doing the investigation like 2 days after whatever event happened, we're doing the investigation 3 weeks after. And the impression that it gives to the employee is that no one's doing anything. Like, I told someone, and no one's doing anything about what I reported. And they're still having to come to work and all of that. So we don't want to put the employee in that situation. We don't want to put the city in that situation either, because that increases risk for the city. So we want to do this as soon as possible, as soon as humanly possible, to shoot that email from your phone, put those couple of sentences in there, and let the city follow their procedures. Common mistakes. So these are mistakes, real-life mistakes that we've seen happen when employees report to leaders of municipalities, including board members like yourself. The promise of complete confidentiality. And I know I've talked about the internal investigation, but that is it's an impossibility if we're going to conduct a full and fair internal investigation. So our rule is the need to know. So it's not disseminated. We're not going to send out a memo. We're not going to tell your whole team. But we have to do an investigation. The city's going to have to do an investigation, which means that we're going to have to contact either witnesses, the accused, and the reporter. So ignoring an issue raised off the record. So some employees will say, they'll come up to you and say, off the record, can I just discuss something with you? It's like, oh, like, I have an obligation to report it, but please let me know what you're thinking. Because we can't have an off the record complaint. If it's a complaint, we have to forward it up and make sure it gets to the correct people. Why don't you go back and write that up? They don't have to write anything up. Once it leaves their lips and it hits your eardrum, the city's responsible for the information that was shared. And also, we can't ignore anything that is hearsay again. Thinking about not making commentary on whether or not the report, statement, whatever have you, is true. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, we're still gonna have to do the internal investigation. Again, I'm relieving y'all of even thinking about that, because after the internal investigation, if it's just gossip and there's nothing to substantiate it, it becomes an unsubstantiated complaint. Expectations for leaders, like you. We want to lead from example. We're not going to do any of the things that we've talked about. We're not going to discriminate, harass, retaliate against any of our employees or fellow colleagues. By leading from example, we set expectations for others' behavior. We make sure that they know this is our expectation for how leaders are supposed to act in our city. Understand and also reinforce the city's policies. We talked about a few. The city has a robust set of policies to govern us as leaders and employees of the city. So be familiar with them so that you can point people in the right direction for that. Facilitate reporting of complaints and incidents as soon as possible. We've already talked about that, without delay. Cooperate with any investigations. So city attorney calls you, they're like, hey, or even HR, hey, we need to interview you for this internal investigation. Cooperate with it. Like, we, as much as we want to put that on the city and make sure that we follow the procedures, we also have to be a willing participant there if we're a witness, or if we're accused, quite frankly. And to keep the matter confidential, not anonymous, but confidential. And we've rounded home base. Any questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate y'all today. Thank you for coming. I know it's an early morning.